Hello and welcome to my podcast Media and Ideology, Ideology According to Zizek Part 2. Today I'll be talking about ideology, neoliberalism and technofeudalism. So to sum up, there is magic and transcendence in our secular and enlightened post-neoliberal world, even though we might think of ourselves as utilitarian pragmatics. We are actually being fetishists in our actions who believe through a distance in otherworldly properties of money and commodities. It is therefore useless to try and look at reality as it is, and to expect that the veil of ideology will then be magically lifted. Whether it is far-right extremism or the belief in the so-called neoliberal individualism, ideologies are rooted in reality and cannot be confronted or debunked by merely stating certain facts, however true and convincing they might be. The veil itself is the ruse. Zizek often quotes the classic Greek tale of Zeus and Parrhasius, as told by Jacques Lacan, about two painters competing in creating the more realistic painting. Zeus painted such realistic grapes that birds flew down and wanted to pick at them. Parrhasius, on the other hand, painted an also very realistic whale on a wall. Zeus, upon seeing the whale, asked Parrhasius to lift the whale and show him what is behind it. Lacan draws from this the conclusion that, quote, the example of Parrhasius makes it clear that if one wishes to deceive a man, what one presents to him is the painting of a whale, that is to say, something that incites him to ask what is behind it. The whale therefore ignites our imagination and desire, the idea that there must be something valuable or true behind it. The desire to know what goes on behind the scenes, as it were, and exactly here we are prone to falling into the ideological trap. This is also crucial for understanding the media landscape today. Whether in wildest online conspiracy theories or in fact-based investigative journalism, the same underlying structure is at work. The point, therefore, is not only that we are deceived by the surface, we are rather deceived by our own desire for the knowledge of what might be behind it. The role of the media is, among other things, to offer us that painted whale. We can also conceive of this in terms of the functioning of the magic trick. Magicians performing on stage or on TV, and today increasingly on social media, hold their audiences captured as long as their magic trick, be it a simple card trick or levitating right in front of their eyes, works in real time. We, the audience, know that this is a trick, and we can still enjoy it even when we afterwards see the explanation of how it works. The trick therefore works although we know that it is a trick. This is its basic structure. Only if the magicians were to make an unfortunate mistake right in front of our eyes, the trick would fall apart and we would become instantly disenchanted. The same holds, I argue, for politics. Politicians, as the ultimate magicians of our time, can trick us, and their trick works even though we know it is a trick. Afterwards, the revelations of crime or corruption, the dismantling and debunking of their trickery and treachery end up being futile. The ideological spell remains intact. This can be witnessed in many cases, ranging from Nazism and Adolf Hitler all the way to what Nancy Fraser calls reactionary neoliberalism of Donald Trump, as opposed to the Clintonite progressive neoliberalism, as well as with other similarly nefarious figures and pernicious ideologies that persist even after the facts about their crimes have long been revealed. The myriads of cases of corruption and deception divert our gaze from the truth of the system itself. The capitalist system is flawed even at its best. We do not need corruption and its failures in order to criticize it. Public figures like Trump are immune to any facts thrown at them, regardless, be they the number of convictions or secret recordings that prove corruption. All of these facts will be appropriated by ideology and again disavowed in true fetishistic fashion. We know very well that the system produces catastrophes, but still, we decide to stick with it as our only viable option. We know very well, for instance, that Trump is a crook, to paraphrase Richard Nixon, but that does not hurt him. His magic, as it were, works even when we know every little dirty detail, and even more so. The formula of ideology of the Trump voter is therefore, I know very well, but still, Trump is not really a better option than any Democrat belonging to the establishment who has betrayed us countless times already. What we do know is that we do not want the Democrats in power. Therefore, the laundry list of Trump's crimes and misdemeanors is rendered useless. It is also being repeated ad nauseum across the media in recent years that we live in a so-called post-truth era of fake news. As a result, it appears that in the liberal democratic societies, exposing certain truths in the media has become increasingly neutralized. No matter how often the dirty tricks of corrupt politicians are publicized, they, as already elaborated, somehow manage to perform their tricks time and again and get away with it. One crucial role of ideology is to, in a way, explain the world to us and to create a complete picture of a society where its problems and contradictions are neatly resolved. One basic element is, of course, the idea of an either internal or external enemy as the main reason for the problems that befall the people. For Nazis, there were Jews and Bolsheviks. For communist regimes, it was the capitalist West or the enemy from within, dissident traitors. For religions, it is the religion or ethnicity of other groups of people. How does this work then in what we might still designate as so-called neoliberal ideology? Although the days of neoliberalism already seem counted. It is clear that at its center, the entrepreneurial individual reigns supreme. The famous Marxist David Harvey gives a concise definition of neoliberalism, which also points out its crucial relationship to the state and the role individualism plays in it. Here is the rather lengthy quote from David Harvey. Neoliberalism is in the first instance a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. The role of the state is to create and preserve an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. The state has to guarantee, for example, the quality and integrity of money. It must also set up those military, defense, police, and legal structures. End quote. Harvey also reiterates that neoliberalism is masked by a lot of rhetoric about individual freedom, liberty, personal responsibility, and the virtues of privatization. It legitimizes draconian policies designated to restore and consolidate capitalist class power. Neoliberalism is not the name of a new system that was put in place in order to somehow replace the former. It is rather the name of the restoration of the pre-New Deal capitalism and the ideological struggle which aims at the destruction of the welfare state, not only as a reality but also as an idea. We have to therefore keep in mind that the ideological notion of the individual must not be opposed to some blurry notion of collectivism, but rather to a possibility of a non-ideological notion of individuality. Again, capitalism's liberation in the 1970s and 1980s and its ideology are at work while we are completely aware of it. There is no so-called false consciousness to break out from. We know that we are being increasingly exploited in never-before-seen ways, but we still keep on working for or actively using Amazon, Uber, or Google, since we have no other choice. Or do we? Maybe there is an alternative, but its name, be it social democracy, socialism, or communism, is being repressed or disavowed increasingly. This repression or disavowal is nothing mysterious or subconscious. It is simply the logic of, if not capitalism, then what? Gulag? What we get instead as a solution is the end of the neoliberal era and the turn to post-capitalism, the domination of digital platforms and their owners, or as Yanis Varoufakis, the Greek economist, calls it, Technofeudalism. I will return to this term Technofeudalism later. So, simply put, in the so-called neoliberal era, being in its prime from the mid-70s till arguably the financial crisis of 2008, freedom of the individual is opposed to the so-called big government, and at the same time to the idea of communism as faithless collectivism of 20th century socialist regimes. The individual can only be free in the post-capitalist market society where it can fully develop and succeed, all the while having as an enemy the quote government that somehow is still there, lurking in the background to collect taxes and oppress you with its suffocating bureaucracy and potentially oppressive policing. The reality is naturally quite different. The mythical individual falls into the trap of so-called false pride, dreams of achieving happiness and prosperity solely on their own, and has only itself to blame in case of failure. Simultaneously, as it is well known, big government does exist and does enact socialism for the rich, for corporations and big tech. There seemingly is no way out, since, as any ideology, this one, the neoliberal, also seeks to eradicate its traces and present itself as non-ideological. Everything else, especially its critique, is itself decried as ideological. Still, there seems to be enough proof that creative and entrepreneurial individuals can actually make it. From the billionaire mastermind Elon Musk all the way to the perhaps most successful contemporary podcaster Joe Rogan. Every dog has his day, as they say. In the decades following the neoliberal turn, the recourse to this mythic individualism has found its most clear iteration in the notion of what Zizek calls the entrepreneur of the self. Quote, "This is the latest ideological triumph of capitalism. Each worker becomes his or her own capitalist, the entrepreneur of the self, who decides how much to invest in his or her own future education, health, and so on, paying for these investments by getting indebted. The rights to education, healthcare, housing, etc. thus become free decisions to invest in, which are formally at the same level as the banker's or capitalist's decision to invest in this or that company, so that at this formal level, everyone is a capitalist getting indebted in order to invest. The freedom of choice imposed on, for instance, the worker is a false one. It is the very form of his or her servitude," Zizek writes. And one of its newest iterations can be found on social media, the entrepreneur of the self, or the new entrepreneurs of the self, are small capitalists, podcasters and influencers on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, etc. They use their, to quote Marx, means of production available to them in order to create content, using all what Nancy Fraser calls background conditions of possibility, like internet or water, sewage and other commons that are simply there. All of this is invested into an enterprise which in turn creates wealth for the big tech, who are in fact the big few controlling and owning as their private property, in strict Marxist sense, the digital space. This space, the cloud, is of course very material. The server farms on the opposite end of the clouds, that is, here on Earth. These technofeudalists, as Varoufakis calls them, therefore need actual land in order to build their own cloud fiefdom, as well as the digital land, which they can further extract rents from. It is not that we, as opposed to capitalists, now can own the real means of production. Rather, we are being redefined as capitalist entrepreneurs and therefore can now own some of the means of production. It turns out, in an ironic twist of history, that it has become more profitable to be a feudal master than a capitalist. Capitalists are being degraded as we speak, and proletariat or precariat is being elevated to the status of the individual capitalist entrepreneur. So, now let me say a word or two about the idea of technofeudalism. According to Yanis Varoufakis, capitalism, and with it also the welfare state and social democracy, at least in Europe, has already ended, as he writes, not with a revolutionary bang, but with an evolutionary whimper. We are already living in the age of technofeudalism, the economy dominated by technofiefdoms, whose most prominent examples are of course digital platforms like Facebook or Meta, Amazon and Google in the US, and their powerful equivalents in China. These are ruled by so-called genius tech entrepreneurs, the poster boys of capitalist individualism, who, with a little help from their friends, and first and foremost the state, have become our new corporate overlords. As Varoufakis observes, the working class, which still exists, I might add, is also shrinking, although Amazon's wealth creation still hinges on the excruciating labor of ordinary workforce who pick and pack and deliver. Regardless of the revenue and market dominance, the wealth of Bezos and co. is based on financial capitalism and rent. As Varoufakis writes, today capitalist relations remain intact, but techno-feudalist relations have begun to overtake them. We are experiencing a change in and of the system simultaneously. Capitalist societies were of course always such hybrids, mixed economies, but situation is becoming more complex still. At the center of this is ideology which supports the system in order to account for its contradictions. This ideology is also a combination of different existence notions and ideologies. Traditional American individualism, for instance, with its pursuit of happiness written into the Constitution, combined with neoliberal ideology of entrepreneurial individualism. In essence, we are increasingly left to fend for ourselves as the state becomes or is perceived by the people as solely an oppressive apparatus, and as such primarily an instrument of the rich and powerful, the ruling classes, as Marx would have put it. The role of the welfare state in the West, in the European West, is either shrinking or is ossified, a shadow of its former self, merely tolerated by capital and center-right political parties who do not want to lose their voters, many of whom depend on welfare. Other parts of the world are very likely to never even get a taste of this system. They are either drowning in debt, austerity, or simply in abject poverty. The basic functioning of the current political economic system, according to Varoufakis, is in essence simple. Money is being generously funneled to big corporations and away from ordinary people. One might also call them or us subjects of the system that at the same time destroys and trivializes the notion of individuality and individual freedom made possible through the welfare state. For instance, going to the doctors without having to worry about finances. The sad truth is that this individual as the sublime object of current ideology is first and foremost important because of the data it produces. All the little things we say or type that are mined and sold for profits, as it is generally well known. The ideology that propagates this entrepreneurial individual effectively destroys the remaining social links and potential solidarity between people. Individuals in fact suffer as individuals, as we are being deprived of freedoms and leisure time, while increasingly burdened with constant struggle for survival. Meanwhile, there is a sort of a structural solidarity, one could say, among capitalists, techno-feudalists. No matter what, they always stick together, even when they try to destroy each other. The victims of these purges are merely sacrificed at the altar of capital. It is important that the system itself survives, paradoxically, even if it has to die and let something new emerge from its ashes. Technofeudalism, the rule of tech overlords, is based on the new form of capital which Varoufakis calls cloud capital, and to which we are connected through our personal assistant, Amazon's Alexa and the likes. Within this context, YouTubers and other content creators are small capitalists fighting for their share of profits, while the techno-feudalists are collecting rent. Meanwhile, we all contribute to the wealth of techno-feudalists by simply being on their platforms and generating what Shoshana Zuboff calls behavioral surplus, which means clicking on a certain product, commenting, liking, etc. Thank you for listening, and if you like this content, please like and subscribe to the channel.